David?
Yes?
Don't do that to him.
Well, we heard the second sonata, or sometimes called the Funeral March Sonata. We're going to hear the third and last of Chopin's piano sonatas today in various performances. There are some very great performances of this work. One is Dino Lipati. There is the famous William Capell performance, which certainly should be re-released by RCA. That's a crime.
That it's not out.
Absolutely.
That's strange that two pianists of whom I think as being contemporaries of each other and who died tragically about the same time, that they both should have what you consider to be remarkable performances of the same work. You know, Lipati
right, and much
Capell.
So different. They're at opposite extremes, in my opinion. The Capell is lean, daring, technically just magnificent. Lipati is calm, lyrical. And this sonata, I think, has so many possibilities. I think it's very difficult for the performer because it has many problems of tempo, phrasing, pedaling, and so forth.
How about historically, before Lipati and Capell? They're from that era of, what, the late 50s,
yes,
early 60s, whatever. How about before then? Who were the great performers of that? Or was the work unpopular before
The
then?
work has done fairly well in the 20th century, but had been overshadowed by the Funeral March Sonata, as one can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But within the last generation and a half, the third sonata has come into its own. Now, we won't begin with the first movement. We will hear the scherzo, the smallest of the 6 Chopin scherzi. And we have a brand new recording, and we will hear, for the first time on these programs, Ilana Vared. The shortest of the 6 pieces labeled scherzo. And it fits in beautifully into the total picture of the four movements.
Was it written at the same time as the rest of the movements?
Yes, all of these, I think, were written at the same time. The first movement is a grand structure, and I think it has perhaps one of the great melodies ever composed in it, as you'll hear in a second, Matt. The second movement is this delicious light scherzo. The third movement is a remarkable slow movement, and the finale is a rondo. Presto, non tanto, not too fast, and it's an extraordinary work of agitated glory, and a structurally quite a last movement. Let's now hear just the first movement in the performance by Dino Lipati. Dinu Lipati in the first movement of the B minor Chopin Sonata, Opus 58.
We'll pause now for a few messages.
Today we're looking at and hearing, of course, the third sonata of Friedrich Chopin, and I think there are many, many great performances, and we are going to hear different movements before we hear the entire work. We started with Ilona Vered in the Scherzo movement. We just heard Lipati in the first movement. I was reading that in an article, John Ogden discussing the sonata, and he thinks that the best recordings, at least that he has heard, are Weisenberg and Lipati. They're so very different. Let's hear now the last movement of the B minor sonata, the Rondo, in a performance by Weisenberg. the last movement of the B minor sonata. So we have played movement 2, movement 1, movement 4, and we'll hear now the third movement, one of Chopin's most beautiful, beautiful movements, I think. Doing that is a little disconcerting. It's
I was wondering why you're doing it, and you might as well have an explanation.
Well, I was reading a little paragraph by Henry T. Fink, who was an American music critic of great influence until about 1920. He was a great defender of Chopin's sonatas. And he was writing that the psychology of the sonata form is false. Men and women do not feel happy for 10 minutes, as in the opening allegro of a sonata, then melancholy for another 10 minutes, as in the following adagio, then frisky, as in the scherzo, and finally fury and impetuousness for 10 minutes, as in the finale. The movements of our minds are seldom so systematic as this. Sad and happy thoughts and moods chase one another incessantly and irregularly, as they do in the compositions of Chopin, which therefore are much truer echoes of our modern romantic feelings than the stiff and formal classical sonatas. And thus it is that Chopin's habitual neglect of the sonata form, instead of being a defect, reveals his rare artistic subtlety and grandeur. Well, I never really thought of the sonata form as that simplistic. However, I think it is disconcerting to hear the movements in different order or just out of context. However, it's like a pianist in your home practicing the different movements, and we will certainly hear the entire sonata. Now let's go to the third movement. You see, I think, Matt, that this sonata is organically a marvel, and they sound best as the full 4 movements. Chopin has always been criticized as not being able to build a large-scale work.
Well, he's done it here. Although I thought in the scherzo that that could easily stand on its own.
I don't think that.
You don't think that at all?
Not at all, no.
It's so woven into what comes before and what comes after.
Yes. Of course, that possibly is my conditioning from hearing the sonata as a whole.
Well, also the last movement, I thought, could stand on its own as an interesting piece. Although, now that I've already heard the other movements, of course, I would want to hear it in context. But out of context, it doesn't seem to be lacking anything. I mean, it's not like a movement of a symphony. A movement of a symphony has this feeling of incompleteness.
Well, these are movements of a symphony. This is a sonata for piano is a symphony. It just happens to be, it's the same form, the string quartet, the sonata. Right. The sonata is meaning the sonata allegro form, which is the first movement. And this is the same for the symphony or the string quartet or concerto.
Maybe there's some preconditioning
Sure,
involved.
This is the great classical form. Let's hear the third movement in a performance by Rubinstein. Arthur Rubinstein, third movement of Chopin's Third Sonata.
We'll return to David Dubal and a musical offering in just a moment.
Well, do we have anything queued up for our next music?
No, as a matter of fact, we don't.
All right. I would love very much to hear Joseph Hoffman performing the first movement of the sonata.
I see.
We heard Lapati. Now, this is all we have of the third sonata in Hoffman's performance. This was made approximately 1935 in a studio, and they were re-released, or I think released for the first time in 2-3 years ago. It's a performance that is unusual, to say the least, and so highly crafted that I think only a pianist who has studied the density of this work could understand with what ease he tosses the difficulties off. That was the incomparable Josef Hoffmann in the first movement of the B minor sonata. So we have heard today in this sonata Vered, Lapati, Weisenberg, Rubinstein, Hoffmann,
and Capel.
Well, we will hear Capel, even though we're running over. I would like you to hear the last movement in Capel's performance. slaughtered in an air crash at the age of 31. William Capell was, without a doubt, the greatest pianist of his generation. He died in 1953, and we will hear the complete performance of the B minor sonata with Capell